Businessman humbles simple rancher, gets the biggest lesson of his life from his father. Richard Thornton struggled to breathe as the luxury car's air conditioning fought against the scorching heat of the Texas prairie. He adjusted his tie, annoyed by the dust stubbornly settling on his Italian suit, while disdainfully eyeing the rural property ahead. With firm steps and papers in hand, Richard crossed the dirt-packed yard toward the main house of Golden Oak Ranch. His calculating eyes already envisioned how those fertile lands would become one of the largest agro-industrial complexes in the Midwest. The rancher Joseph Miller would be just another obstacle to remove from his path. What Richard didn't expect was his own father, Andrew Thornton, watching everything from the porch with a stern gaze. The same man who had left their mansion in the city 3 months ago without explanation. "Mr. Miller, with all due respect, you need to understand this offer is more than fair," Richard said, arranging the documents on the rustic kitchen table, completely ignoring his father's silent presence in the corner. "If you don't accept now, I can guarantee the next contact will be through our lawyers, and then you might end up with nothing." Joseph, a man with calloused hands and a sun-weathered face, pressed his lips together and stared at the papers before him. "Son, I've worked this land my whole life, so did my father and grandfather before me. What you're offering doesn't even cover half its worth," the rancher replied, his voice steady despite his humble tone. "Listen here, Mr. Miller." Richard raised his voice, leaning over the table. "These lands are practically unproductive. You don't have the technology, the scale, or a future here. I'm being generous." That's when Andrew Thornton finally spoke, his deep voice freezing Richard in place. "Generous would be having manners when entering someone else's home, son." Richard turned slowly, as if only now fully registering his father's presence. Andrew was dressed plainly, a cotton shirt and worn-out pants, nothing like the powerful businessman he had once been in New York City. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Richard asked, trying to mask his discomfort. "I live here now," Andrew answered bluntly. "And it seems I arrived just in time to see the man I raised treating an honest worker like trash." Silence filled the room. Joseph glanced between them, gradually understanding the situation. "I didn't know you were Mr. Thornton's son," the rancher said, eyeing Richard with new judgment. Richard took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "That doesn't change what we're discussing here. This is business." "Business?" Andrew cut in, stepping toward the table. "Is this how I taught you to do business? Threatening, hard-working people?" "Dad, with all due respect, you don't understand the potential of this land. The project. I understand more than you think, Richard," Andrew interrupted again. "Mr. Miller, you have every right to send my son off your property. He's not representing the family company here." Richard paled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you'll gather those papers, apologize to Mr. Miller, and meet me for dinner tonight. We have a lot to discuss." Richard hesitated, torn between anger and confusion. He looked at Joseph, who maintained a quiet dignity, then at his father, whose expression left no room for argument. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Miller," he finally said, gathering the documents with stiff movements. "I'll reach out another time." "That won't be necessary," the rancher replied calmly, standing up. "This land isn't for sale, son. Not today, not ever." Richard stepped out of the house, feeling the weight of their gazes on his back. Inside the luxury car, now an oven under the Texas prairie sun, he slammed his fist against the steering wheel. How dare his father humiliate him like this? And what the hell was he doing at that miserable ranch? The sun was beginning to set when Richard returned to Golden Oak Ranch, this time without any folders or documents. As he parked near the modest house, he noticed his father waiting for him on the porch, seated in a wooden chair, gazing at the orange horizon. "Glad you came," Andrew said as his son approached. "Let's go inside, dinner's almost ready." To Richard's surprise, his father led him to the set table in the kitchen. There were no servants, just old Joseph, finishing up by placing a steaming dish of rice at the center. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the room. Cowboy beans, ribs, sautéed squash, and fresh collard greens. "Have a seat, Richard," Joseph invited, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the morning's tension. "Hope you like simple food." Richard sat uncomfortably, still wearing his now wrinkled suit. "Thank Giles," he murmured out of politeness. For the first few minutes they ate in silence. Richard noticed his father seemed perfectly at ease in this rustic setting, so different from the upscale restaurants they frequented in New York City. "How are things at the company?" Andrew finally asked. "Good. The Midwest expansion project is moving forward," Richard replied, locking eyes with his father, despite some unexpected obstacles. Andrew nodded, wiping his mouth with a cloth napkin. "Richard, do you know why I came to this ranch?" "I have no idea, Dad. You just disappeared, leaving a vague note. 3 months without proper updates. Just saying you were fine and needed time. Mom's worried, I'm worried." Andrew exchanged a glance with Joseph, who gave a slight nod, as if granting permission. "This land used to be ours, Richard." The businessman froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" "Before you were born, I inherited a ranch from my father. Not this exact one, but part of this land. We were ranchers, not businessmen," Andrew explained, his gaze distant. "But I had big dreams, wanted to expand, build an empire. I took out loans, made risky investments, and lost everything." Richard set his fork down, his attention now fully on his father. "You never told me that." "Because I was ashamed. I preferred to build a new story somewhere else," Andrew continued. "We moved to New York City, started from scratch in construction, and it worked. You grew up believing we'd always been who we are today. And what does Joseph have to do with this?" It was then the rancher spoke, placing a wrinkled hand on the table. "My father, Anthony Miller, bought part of this land when your father had to sell. He always respected your Andrew deeply, said he was an honorable man who just had bad luck in business. More than that," Andrew added, "Anthony lent me money to start over in New York City when no one else believed in me. Without him, Thornton Construction wouldn't exist." Richard swallowed hard, the pieces falling into place. "So you came here to repay a debt of honor," Andrew finished. "When I heard the company was planning to buy land in this region, I came to see for myself. I discovered it was the family's old property, and that Joseph here was struggling. My son passed away 2 years ago," Joseph explained, his voice thick. "He handled the administrative side, the contracts with buyers. Since then, I've been fighting to keep everything running, and I discovered our company was using questionable methods to pressure small landowners into selling," said Andrew, staring at his son with a stern expression. "That's not how I taught you to do business, Richard." Richard felt his face burn, partly from anger, partly from shame. "Dad, the market has changed. If we're not aggressive, we lose ground. This region will develop with or without us." "At what cost?" Andrew challenged. "By destroying families who've worked this land for generations?" Silence fell over the table again. Outside, the nighttime sounds of the Texas prairie grew louder. Crickets, cicadas, and the occasional hoot of an owl. "What do you want me to do then? Abandon the entire project?" Andrew exchanged another meaningful look with Joseph. "We want to propose something different," his father said. "A project that benefits everyone, including the local community." Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I'm listening." The conversation stretched late into the night. When Richard finally returned to his hotel in the nearby town, his mind buzzed with conflict. Part of him wanted to ignore everything he'd heard and stick to his original plans. Another part couldn't shake the look on his father's face when speaking about a past he'd never shared. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now continuing. In the weeks that followed, Richard split his time between the hotel in town and visits to Golden Oak Ranch. Reluctant at first, he began learning about the property's operations. Joseph, despite his natural wariness, patiently explained planting cycles, the quirks of the local soil, and the challenges faced by small producers in the region. "How you seem to understand far more about farm management than you let on," Richard remarked one afternoon as they walked through the cornfield stretching to the horizon. 40 years working this land, son," Joseph replied simply. "Didn't have schooling like you, but life teaches plenty." Richard nodded, watching the farmer's calloused hands adjust a support stake. He was starting to see past the rough exterior, recognizing a practical wisdom no MBA could provide. Mr. Miller, can I ask you something? Why don't you sell? You could buy a house in town, live comfortably off the sale money." The old farmer stopped what he was doing and looked Richard straight in the eye. "Son, life ain't just about comfort. This land holds my family's story. Every tree, every fence, every inch of soil carries my father's sweat, my sweat, and would have carried my son's if he were still here." His voice wavered slightly at the end. "You got anything like that in your life? Something you wouldn't trade for any amount of money?" The question caught Richard off guard. He thought of his apartments, cars, investments, all replaceable, all acquired just to flaunt status or make more money. "I don't know," he answered honestly. Joseph smiled faintly, a touch of sadness in it. "Then you haven't found what truly matters yet." Their talk was interrupted by the arrival of a pickup truck. Out stepped a woman around 40, her brown hair tied in a ponytail, her expression determined. "Dad, I closed the deal with the market in Austin," she announced excitedly, waving some papers before noticing Richard. "Oh, sorry. Didn't know we had company." "Hannah, this is Richard, Mr. Thornton's son," Joseph introduced. "Richard, this is my daughter Hannah. She teaches at the rural school and has been my right hand here on the ranch since her brother passed." "Pleasure," Richard said, extending his hand, surprised by the revelation. In the weeks he had spent at the ranch, he had never heard mention of Joseph's daughter. Hannah shook his hand briefly, her firm grip contrasting with her delicate appearance. "So you're the businessman who wants to buy our land," she said bluntly. "My father told me about your visits." Richard immediately noticed the defensive tone. "I'm just getting to know the property better," he replied diplomatically. "Your father has been very generous in showing me around." Murmured Hannah, clearly unconvinced. "Dad, we need to talk about these contracts. They're great news for us." "Of course, my dear. Richard was just about to leave, weren't you?" Richard took the hint. "Yes, I need to get back to the city. Tomorrow I have an important video conference with the office in New York City." As he drove back, Richard couldn't shake the distrustful look on Hannah's face. It was as if she could see right through his facade of genuine interest, spotting his true intentions. And that bothered him more than he cared to admit. In his hotel room, Richard was analyzing spreadsheets and reports on his laptop when his phone rang. It was Michael Carson, his business partner and college friend. "Hey, Richard, how much longer are you going to stay buried in the middle of nowhere?" Michael asked bluntly. "As long as it takes," Richard replied, rubbing his temples. "The situation is more complicated than we thought." "Complicated how?" "I thought we just had to make an offer they couldn't refuse." Richard hesitated before answering. "My father is involved. He has a history with this land." "Your father? The one who disappeared months ago without a word?" Michael sounded surprised. "What does he have to do with this?" "It's a long story," Richard deflected. "The point is, he knows the owner and is proposing a different approach." "What kind of approach?" "A partnership instead of an acquisition. Something that preserves the ranch's identity but modernizes production." The silence on the other end was followed by a disbelieving laugh. "You're joking, right? Richard, we're not a charity. Investors expect quick returns. This preserving identity talk doesn't pay dividends." "I know that, Michael. I'm just exploring alternatives." "Alternatives?" Michael's voice hardened. "Richard, you have 2 weeks to close this deal, or we'll have to reconsider your role in the project." The board is getting impatient. The veiled threat didn't go unnoticed. "Understood," Richard replied curtly. "I'll keep you updated." After hanging up, Richard sat motionless, staring at his phone screen. The pressure from investors on one side, the new understanding about his father and the ranch on the other. He felt caught between two worlds that seemed increasingly incompatible. The next morning, during his video conference with New York City, Richard maintained his usual professional demeanor, but his heart wasn't in it. As they discussed financial projections and expansion strategies, his mind wandered to his conversations with Joseph, to Hannah's distrustful gaze, to the visible change in his father since he had settled at the ranch. "Richard, do you agree with the proposal?" The CFO's voice snapped him back to reality. "Sorry, Christine, could you repeat the last part?" he asked, quickly regaining his composure. "I was saying that if we can't close the deal on the land, In Texas, we should redirect investments to Oklahoma. We already have promising contacts there. Richard felt an inexplicable pang of discomfort. Let's exhaust all possibilities with Golden Oak Ranch first, he replied, surprising himself, with the firmness in his voice. I believe we can still reach an agreement. After ending the meeting, Richard stepped out to walk the streets of the small town. It was market day, and the central square was filled with colorful stalls where local farmers sold their goods. Fruits, vegetables, artisanal cheeses, homemade sweets, all proudly displayed by simple folks who, like Joseph, made their living from the land. Among the vendors, he recognized Hannah, who was organizing a stand with organic products from Golden Oak Ranch. Without overthinking, he approached. "Good morning," he greeted, feeling oddly nervous. Hannah looked up from the tomatoes she was arranging and recognized him. "Good morning, Mr. Big Shot," she replied with a hint of sarcasm. "Come to see what us country folk do in our free time." Richard ignored the jab. "Actually, I came to buy something for breakfast. I'm tired of hotel food." Hannah studied him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. "In that case, I'd recommend the fresh cheese and the cream cheese. We make them right at the ranch." Richard pointed to the items. "I'll take both then, and those guavas too, they look great." As Hannah packed his order, Richard observed the lively market around him. There was a sense of community here he'd never experienced in New York City. People chatting animatedly, catching up, children darting between the stalls. "That'll be $22, Hannah said, handing him the bag. Richard gave her a 50. "Keep the change." Hannah pushed the bill back, her expression firm. "We don't need charity, Mr. Thornton. It's $22 exactly." Embarrassed, Richard fumbled for the correct amount. "Sorry, I didn't mean to offend. It's just customary in New York to round things off. Here, we believe in fair pay for fair work," Hannah replied, her slight smile softening her words. "No more, no less." Richard nodded, inexplicably drawn to her straightforward honesty. It was so different from the people he usually dealt with. "Your father mentioned you're a teacher," he said, trying to keep the conversation going. "At the rural school, yes. I teach elementary kids," she answered, adjusting some strawberries on the stand. "After my brother. After he passed, I split my time between the school and helping my father at the ranch. That must be hard." "It's the life I chose," she said simply. "And you? Always wanted to be a businessman buying land from simple folks?" The pointed question made Richard smile despite himself. "Truthfully, I never thought much about it. Just followed in my father's footsteps at the company. It was expected." "Interesting how your father seems to be taking a very different path now," Hannah observed. Richard nodded. "Yeah, and it's been making me think a lot lately." Their eyes met briefly, and Richard felt an unexpected connection. There was something about Hannah, maybe her authenticity, maybe the passion with which she defended her way of life, that intrigued him deeply. "Well, I've got other customers to tend to," she said, breaking the moment. "Enjoy your breakfast." "Thank you," Richard replied, stepping away with his bag. As he walked back to the hotel, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about financial reports, board meetings, or business strategies. He was simply savoring the taste of a fresh guava, grown on the very land he'd been so eager to transform into something entirely different. That afternoon, an unexpected storm swept through the area. Richard was watching from his hotel window when his phone rang. It was his father. "Richard, I need your help." Andrew's voice was urgent. "The storm damaged part of the barn roof. We're trying to save the equipment and the stored harvest." "I'm on my way," he answered without hesitation. When he arrived at the ranch, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Employees and neighbors formed a human chain, hauling sacks of grain and small machinery from the partially roofless barn. The rain kept pouring, and everyone worked soaked to the bone. Richard parked and rushed to help. Without a second thought for his designer watch or Italian shoes, he joined the chain, carrying heavy sacks of corn to safety. "I found another tarp in the storage," shouted Hannah, appearing with a large blue plastic sheet. "We need to cover the rest." Andrew, completely drenched, directed the men trying to stretch another tarp over the exposed part of the roof. "Richard, come. Help here," he called when he spotted his son. For nearly 2 hours, Richard worked side by side with people he would have considered mere obstacles to his business plans just weeks earlier. He watched as neighbors showed up spontaneously to help, as everyone worked together without needing. Many words, each knowing their role in that community. When they finally secured the barn and saved most of the harvest, Richard was exhausted, soaked, and surprisingly content. There was something genuinely rewarding about working with his own hands, about seeing the immediate results of his physical effort. "Thank you for coming," said Joseph, handing him a towel to dry his face. "Didn't expect to see you, getting dirty in the mud for our harvest." "Neither did I," Richard admitted with a tired smile. Hannah approached with mugs of hot coffee for everyone. "Impressive," she remarked, handing Richard a mug. "The businessman from New York City knows how to work." "Not as well as you all," he replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But I'm learning." Their eyes met again, and this time it was Hannah who smiled first. "I guess there's hope for you after all." That moment, among simple people gathered after facing adversity together, made Richard question the priorities he'd set for his life. The solidarity he'd witnessed was something he'd never experienced in corporate boardrooms. Later that night, when everyone had retired, Richard remained on the porch of the main house with his father. The two men watched the rain, now falling, gently bathing the newly planted fields. "Today you got a taste of what brought me back here," Andrew broke the silence. "How so?" "That sense of belonging, of working for the land, of being part of a community that cares for one another," his father explained. "In New York City, if your company went under tomorrow, how many of your colleagues would show up to help without expecting anything in return?" Richard didn't need to answer. They both knew. "Dad, I still don't fully understand why you left everything to come here," Richard admitted. "You built an empire. You have everything anyone could want." Andrew sighed, his gaze lost in the night's darkness. "When your grandfather passed last year, I found an old journal among his belongings. In it he wrote about how he regretted pressuring me to expand the ranch beyond what was sensible, how he blamed himself for our failure." Richard listened intently. His grandfather had died while he was on a business trip overseas. He'd barely made it to the funeral. "I realized I was doing the same to you," Andrew continued. "Pressuring, demanding results, setting impossible expectations. And for what? To accumulate more? To leave a bigger legacy?" He paused. "When Anthony Miller passed a few years ago, I promised I'd repay what he did for me one day. The opportunity came when I found out Joseph was struggling." "And you just walked away from everything?" "I didn't walk away, Richard. I rediscovered what truly matters. This land, these people. They remind me of where I come from and what truly matters." Richard absorbed his father's words, letting them sink deeper than the layer of skepticism built over years in the corporate world. "What about the company?" "The company is in good hands with you and the board," Andrew replied. "But I'd like you to seriously consider the proposal we made, a partnership that benefits both Thornton Construction and the local community." "I'm not sure the investors would agree." "Richard," his father interrupted, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes we need the courage to do what's right, not what's most profitable in the short term." That night at the ranch marked a turning point for Richard. As he drove back to the hotel in the early hours of the next morning, his phone rang again. It was Michael. "Richard, I've got news," his partner announced excitedly. "I got information about Golden Oak Ranch's debts with the bank. They're about to foreclose on the mortgage. If we wait another month, we can buy it all for half of what we offered." Richard felt a tightness in his chest, so Joseph's situation was even worse than it seemed. "How did you get this information?" "I have my contacts," Michael replied vaguely. "The important thing is we can save a fortune. The old man won't have a choice but to accept whatever offer we make." Richard pulled the car over, suddenly feeling nauseous. "Michael, this doesn't seem ethical." "Ethical?" his partner laughed. "Since when do we care about that? It's business, Richard. Plain and simple." "I need to think about this," he replied, abruptly ending the call. For long minutes he stayed there, watching the sunrise over the fields that were slowly recovering from the previous night's storm. Fields that had supported families for generations. Fields that, if Michael and the investors had their way, would soon be replaced by industrial silos and automated monocultures. That morning, instead of returning to the hotel, Richard drove to the nearby town where the bank branch Michael had mentioned was located. Using his connections and influence, he managed to arrange a meeting with the manager. "Mr. Thornton, it's an honor to have you here," said the manager, a middle-aged man with an obsequious smile. "How can I help you?" "I'd like information about Golden Oak Ranch's financial situation," Richard requested directly. The manager hesitated. "You know I can't share confidential client information." Richard placed his business card on the table. "I understand, but we're considering a significant partnership with the property. It would be a substantial investment benefiting both parties, and of course it would bring plenty of business to your bank." The mention of new business had the desired effect. After a few calls and checks, the manager confirmed what Michael had said. Joseph was indeed on the brink of foreclosure, with only 45 days to settle his debt. "A shame," the manager remarked. "Mr. Miller is a hard-working man, but the last few years have been tough for small producers. Losing his son was a blow he never fully recovered from." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of moral responsibility growing in his chest. "Thank you for the information," he said, standing up. "I'd appreciate discretion about this visit. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story." As he left the bank, Richard walked through the small town streets, his mind racing. He now had information that could be used to pressure Joseph into selling for even less. It was exactly the kind of tactic he would have applied without hesitation a few months ago. But something had changed. Without realizing it, his steps led him to the rural school where Hannah taught. The simple building, painted light blue, was filled with the cheerful sounds of children playing during recess. Through the fence, Richard spotted Hannah organizing an activity with a group of students in the schoolyard. He watched for a few minutes, impressed by the patience and dedication she showed toward each child. It was clear the children adored her, running to show her their drawings or simply to receive a word of encouragement. "Are you looking for someone?" Richard turned, startled. A woman around 60 years old was watching him with a questioning expression. "I was just passing by," he replied, embarrassed at being caught observing the school. "You're Andrew's son, aren't you? The one who wants to buy Joseph's ranch," the woman said, studying him with sharp eyes. "How do you know who I am?" She smiled. "Small town, young man. Everyone knows everything. I'm Mrs. Collins, the principal here." "Nice to meet you," Richard said, extending his hand. "I was just observing the activities. I've never seen a rural school up close before." "Hannah is quite the teacher," Mrs. Collins remarked, gazing fondly at the young woman now gathering the children into a circle. "With her education, she could be teaching at any big school in the city, but she chooses to stay here with our people." "Why?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "Love, young man. Love for the land, for roots, for the community. Something no amount of money can buy," the principal replied simply. "These children are the sons and daughters of small farmers, like Joseph. If the ranches are sold to big corporations, this school will likely close. The families will have to move away." The words hit Richard like a punch. He hadn't considered the broader impact the land acquisition would have on the local community. "I didn't know that," he murmured. "Of course you didn't," Mrs. Collins said without hostility. "When you only look at numbers on a spreadsheet, it's easy to forget there are real people on the other side." Just then, Hannah noticed them talking, and after instructing a colleague to continue the activity with the children, approached. "Mrs. Collins, Richard," she greeted, surprised to see the businessman there. "Is something wrong?" The young man was just getting to know our little school, the principal explained. "I'll let you two talk. I have paperwork to take care of." As the principal walked away, Hannah studied Richard with curiosity. "What are you doing here? I thought you'd be in your important meetings." "I was in town and ended up passing by," he replied, feeling oddly nervous. "You seem to really love what you do." Hannah smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him. "I love teaching, seeing a child discover something new, understanding a concept for the first time. There's no feeling like it. Richard watched the children playing in the background. Mrs. Collins told me the school might close if the land is sold. Hannah's smile faded. Yes, most of the children come from families who work on the small farms around here. If the land is turned into automated industrial operations, many families will lose not just their jobs but their homes too. I hadn't thought about that, Richard admitted. Of course you hadn't, Hannah replied, but without her usual sharpness. It's hard to see the consequences when you're far, removed from the local reality. A bell rang, signaling the end of recess. I need to get back to class, Hannah said, but thank you for caring enough to ask. As she walked away, Richard felt something shift inside him. Hannah's words, the children playing, the reality of this community he was only now truly beginning to understand. It all weighed heavily on his conscience. Back at the hotel, he found several messages from Michael on his phone, all asking about the progress of the plan. He ignored them and instead called his father. I need to talk to you and Joseph, he said as soon as Andrew answered. It's important. Hours later, seated at the same rustic kitchen table on the ranch, Richard laid out everything he had discovered about Joseph's precarious financial situation. The old rancher paled but maintained his dignity. How did you get this information? Andrew asked with a grave expression. That doesn't matter now, Richard replied. What matters is we only have 45 days before the bank forecloses. Joseph lowered his eyes, his calloused hands tightening on the table. I didn't want Hannah to know how bad things were, he murmured. She already works so hard between school and helping me on the ranch. Why didn't you tell me, Joseph? Andrew pressed. Pride, I suppose, the rancher answered with a sigh. I already owed you so much. Richard watched the interaction between the two older men, sensing the depth of mutual respect they had built. I have a proposal, he finally said, drawing their attention. A real proposal, not like the one I made the first time. We're listening, Andrew replied. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. Thornton Construction would buy the debt from the bank, becoming the ranch's creditor. In exchange, we'd establish a partnership. We'd invest in technology and infrastructure to increase productivity, while Joseph would retain operational control and ownership of the land. Joseph and Andrew exchanged surprised glances. Dividends would be shared proportionally to the investment, Richard went on. And we'd include clauses ensuring local jobs are preserved. In fact, with increased productivity, we'd likely need to hire more people. Why would you do this? Joseph asked, skeptical. Weeks ago, you were threatening me with lawyers. Richard held the old rancher's gaze. Because I've learned some important lessons these past weeks, about real value, about community, about what truly matters, he paused, and because I believe we can create something better than I originally planned, something that benefits everyone, not just the shareholders in New York City. Andrew watched his son with a glint of pride in his eyes that Richard hadn't seen in years. And your partners, the investors, his father questioned, would they accept this change of plans? Leave that to me, Richard replied firmly. Some won't be happy, but I can convince the ones who matter. After lengthy discussions about details and guarantees, Joseph finally extended his hand to Richard. If you deliver on what you're promising, we have a deal, the rancher said. But I'll need to see everything in writing with the help of a lawyer I trust. Absolutely fair, Richard agreed, shaking the older man's rough hand. That night, as Richard prepared to return to the hotel, Andrew walked him to the car. I'm proud of you, son, his father said, emotion in his voice. Today, you acted like the man I always hoped you'd become. Richard felt a lump in his throat. How long had it been since he'd heard those words? How desperately had he sought that approval even without realizing it? Thank you, Dad, he replied simply. I still have a lot to learn. We all do, Andrew smiled. It's a lesson that never ends. The next day, Richard returned to New York City for a series of crucial meetings. As expected, Michael and a few other executives reacted with disbelief and anger when he presented his new proposal. Have you lost your mind? Michael exclaimed during a heated, closed-door discussion. We were about to get that land for a song and destroy an entire community in the process. Richard countered. "That's not how I want to do business moving forward." "It's the market, Richard. We've always done it this way." "And maybe that's the problem," Richard replied, keeping his calm. "Maybe it's time to evolve our way of thinking." The battle behind the scenes at the company was intense. Michael Carson rallied allies, trying to undermine Richard's authority. But Andrew, even from a distance, still held significant influence among the older shareholders. After days of exhausting negotiations, Richard managed to get his proposal approved, though with some concessions. When he finally returned to Texas nearly 2 weeks later, Richard carried with him the official documents for the new partnership. Arriving at Golden Oak Ranch, he found not just Joseph Miller and his father, but also Hannah and several locals gathered in the yard. "What's going on?" he asked his father as he parked the car. "Word got out," Andrew explained. "People are curious to know if their jobs and homes are safe." Richard felt the weight of responsibility as he stepped out of the car. Dozens of faces watched him with expressions ranging from hope to skepticism. These were the real people affected by decisions that, not long ago, he would have made without a second thought, comfortably seated in his air-conditioned office in New York City. Hannah approached, her expression serious. "Is it true?" she asked directly. "Did you really propose a partnership that preserves the ranch?" "It's true," Richard confirmed, holding up the folder with the documents. "It's all here, ready, to be reviewed by your father's lawyer." The relief on her face was visible. "Why?" Hannah asked, searching for understanding. "What made you change your mind?" Richard looked around, at the families gathered, at his father watching approvingly, at old Joseph, whose dignity had never wavered even in the hardest times. "I realized we're connected in ways I didn't see before," he answered honestly, "and that there's value in things that don't show up in financial reports." Hannah studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for signs of deceit. What she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said simply. "This means a lot to everyone here." In the weeks that followed, the partnership began to take shape. Engineers from Thornton Construction visited the ranch, studying ways to improve the infrastructure without altering the property's character. Joseph, initially hesitant about accepting changes, gradually warmed to new techniques that would increase productivity while preserving the land's sustainability. Richard, who had originally planned to return to New York City soon, found himself extending his stay. There was something about the ranch's routine, the rhythm of the local community, that drew him in a way he'd never experienced before. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up anxious. He didn't compulsively check his phone every 5 minutes. One afternoon, as he walked through the fields with Hannah, discussing possibilities for creating a small producers' cooperative, she surprised him with an observation. "You're different," she said as they stopped under the shade of a pecan tree. "Less New York." Richard laughed. "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" "A little of both, maybe," Hannah answered with a smile. "But mostly a compliment. You seem more present, more real." A warmth spread through Richard's chest. It was true. Here, among people who valued actions over words, who measured character by honesty and hard work rather than status or bank accounts, he felt more authentic. "You know what's funny?" he remarked. "I came here to change this place and ended up being changed by it." Hannah smiled, this time without a trace of irony or doubt. That's how it works when you truly let yourself know a place, not just see it as a dot on the map. You've always known that, haven't you? That's why you never left here, even though you could have worked at better schools. "Yes," Hannah replied simply. "This is my place in the world, where I can make a difference." Richard watched her in the golden evening light, seeing beyond the rural teacher, beyond the devoted farmer's daughter. He saw a woman of unshakable principles with an inner strength he deeply admired. "And me?" he asked, almost without realizing. "Where's my place?" Hannah looked at him intently. "Only you can discover that, Richard. But I think you've already started looking in the right places." As the sun began to set, they walked back to the ranch house in comfortable silence. In the yard, they found Andrew and Joseph playing checkers, laughing like the old friends they'd always been. "Ah, there you are," Andrew greeted them. We were just talking about the idea of using part of the ranch for agritourism. What do you think? Richard exchanged a knowing glance with Hannah. They had discussed the possibility days earlier. I think it would be perfect, Richard replied, sitting with the older men. Lots of city folks would love to experience rural life for a few days. And it would be an extra source of income for the ranch, Hannah added. We could even create an educational program with the school. The conversation flowed naturally, with ideas being shared and expanded. Richard marveled at the simplicity and yet the depth of that moment. No tight schedules, no constant interruptions from calls and messages, just people sharing thoughts under a starry sky you'd never see in New York City. Later that night after dinner, Richard found himself on the porch with his father again. Are you heading back to New York next week? Andrew asked. I have to, Richard confirmed. I still have responsibilities there. Michael's doing his best to complicate things in my absence. And after, when everything's settled? Richard pondered the question for a moment. I don't know, Dad. For the first time in my life, I don't have a 5-year plan. Andrew smiled, satisfied. Good. Sometimes the best chapters of our lives are the ones we don't plan. The next day, while helping organize documents in the ranch's small office, Richard came across an old box of photographs. With Joseph's permission, he began sifting through them. To his surprise, he found yellowed photos of his father, much younger, standing beside Anthony Miller, Joseph's father. In some pictures, a small boy appeared too. That's me, Joseph remarked, looking over Richard's shoulder. I must have been about 7 in those photos. And this ranch, is it the same one? Yes and no, the farmer replied. It was bigger back then. Part of it was sold when your father hit hard times. This house we're in was the main headquarters. Richard kept examining the photos, absorbing fragments of a family history he'd never known. In one image, his father was holding a baby. Is that me? He asked, surprised. Joseph nodded. Your mother brought you here a few times when you were little, before the troubles. The revelation hit Richard like a wave. He had been to this ranch before as a baby. Somehow the circle was closing. I never knew that, he murmured. There's a lot we don't know about our own history, Joseph said, wisely. Sometimes we need to lose something to appreciate what was always there. That night, Richard called his mother in New York, something he didn't do often enough. Mom, I found some old photos here at the ranch, he said after their initial greetings, pictures of me as a baby with Dad. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I wondered when you'd find out, Elizabeth Thornton finally said. Your father always wanted to tell you, but I thought it best to leave the past behind. Why? Because it was a difficult time, son. Watching your father lose everything. The humiliation we felt. Her voice trembled slightly. When we started over in New York City, we swore to build something solid, something that could never be taken from us again. And you did, Richard affirmed. An empire. Yes, but at what cost? His mother asked with a sigh. Your father became obsessed. So did I. We wanted so badly to protect you from the insecurity we felt that we ended up creating something else. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. What something else, Mom? A life based only on accumulation, on appearances, on status, she replied sadly. I see it now, watching your father find peace away from all that. Is he doing well, Richard? Better than ever, he confirmed, thinking of the renewed spark in his father's eyes. He looks younger, more alive. I'm glad, Elizabeth said sincerely. And you, son? How are you feeling there? The question caught Richard off guard. Different, he answered after a moment, like I'm waking up from a long dream. A dream or a nightmare? His mother asked with an intuition that surprised him. Maybe a bit of both, he admitted. After hanging up, Richard remained outside for a long time, gazing at the stars. His mother's words echoed in his mind, along with everything he'd learned these past weeks. The question that kept resurfacing was, what kind of life did he truly want from now on? The following week, as planned, Richard returned to New York City. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. The chaotic traffic, the frantic pace, the people perpetually rushed and tense. Everything that once felt normal now seemed strange, even oppressive. At the office, the reception was mixed. Some colleagues seemed genuinely happy to see him, while others, especially Michael Carson's allies, barely hid their resentment. The battle for the company's direction was far from over. During a particularly tense meeting, Michael confronted him openly. "Frankly, Richard, I don't even recognize you anymore," the partner said with obvious frustration. "We spent years building an aggressive expansion strategy, and now you want us to believe in sustainable partnerships and community development?" "I'm proposing a new business model, Michael, one that's profitable and socially responsible," Richard replied calmly. "Times have changed. Younger investors are demanding companies with purpose, not just profit." "Tree hugger talk," Michael shot back. "You spend a few weeks on some little ranch and suddenly you're a sustainability expert?" Richard noticed the other directors' glances, some curious, others skeptical. "No, I learned from people who truly understand the land," he said firmly. "And I learned there are better ways to grow, ways that can benefit more people in the long run. Including you, isn't that right?" Michael insinuated with a sly smile. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with the rancher's daughter." The implication made Richard's blood boil, but he kept his composure. "That's irrelevant to this discussion, Michael. We're talking corporate strategy, not my personal life." All right, Christine, the CFO, interjected. "Let's focus on what matters. The numbers in this new proposal are genuinely interesting. We have to admit that." The meeting continued, with Richard detailing the partnership model he was implementing with Golden Oak Ranch and how it could be replicated in other regions. To his surprise, he found more support than he'd expected. Several directors, especially the younger ones, seemed genuinely interested in the approach. In the following days, Richard immersed himself in spreadsheets, reports, and presentations, refining his proposal to make it not only socially appealing, but also financially sound. He worked more hours than usual, but strangely, he didn't feel the same exhaustion. There was a clear purpose now, yet in his penthouse in the city's most upscale neighborhood, he felt uncomfortably out of place. The expensive furniture, the artwork acquired more as investments than out of genuine appreciation, it all seemed somehow empty, devoid of real meaning. One particularly lonely evening, he received a message from Hannah. "How's the battle in New York City? The ranch feels oddly quiet without your impractical ideas." The smiling emoji and playful tone made him smile instantly. Without realizing it, they had developed a friendship that transcended their differences. "Surviving," he replied. "It's harder to change a system from the inside than I imagined. How are things there? Your father and mine are planning to plant a new corn variety. They argue about it all day as if it's the most important decision in the universe." Richard laughed, picturing the scene. "It probably is, for them." "When are you coming back?" Hannah asked after a brief pause in the conversation. The question made Richard reflect. Initially, he had planned to stay in New York City indefinitely, only visiting Texas occasionally to oversee the partnership. But now, "Soon," he finally answered. "I have a few things to wrap up here first." One of those things was sitting across from him the next morning in the main office of Thornton Construction. Michael had requested a private meeting, and his expression was more serious than usual. "Let me get straight to the point, Richard," the partner began. "I've received an offer to lead a new investment fund. I'm leaving the company." Richard couldn't hide his surprise. "Michael, we've worked together for over 10 years, and we've been growing further apart," Michael finished. "Look, I have nothing against your new philosophy, I just don't share it. I prefer to keep doing business the way we always have." Despite their recent tensions, Richard felt a pang of sadness. They had been close friends for so long. "I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe we could find some middle ground." Michael shook his head. "We both know that's not possible. You've changed, Richard. Really changed. This isn't just a phase or a strategy." He paused. "To be honest, I can't decide whether I admire you or think you've lost your mind." Richard smiled faintly. "Maybe a little of both." After Michael's departure, a strange sense of relief washed over Richard. It was as if the last tie to his old mindset had been severed, making room for something new. In the weeks that followed, he focused on restructuring the company's leadership. With his father's support, joining strategic meetings remotely, Richard promoted executives more aligned with the new vision. To his satisfaction, he discovered that many in the company were eager for change, for a purpose beyond quarterly profits. Finally, after nearly 2 months in New York City, Richard felt the transition was stable enough. On the eve of his return to Texas, he received an unexpected visit at his penthouse, his mother. "You're really going, aren't you?" Elizabeth asked, eyeing her son's half-packed suitcases. "I am, Mom, at least for a while. I need to oversee the ranch project in person." Elizabeth Thornton, ever elegant and composed, studied her son with perceptive eyes. "It's more than that, isn't it?" she asked gently. "You found something there, or someone." Richard felt like an open book under his mother's intuition. "I found a clarity, I think," he answered honestly. "And yes, I met people who made me question much of what I considered important. The rancher's daughter." Richard couldn't help but smile. "Hannah is different from anyone I've ever met. Authentic, passionate about what she does, unwavering in her principles. Sois and pretty, I imagine," Elizabeth added with a mischievous smile. "That too," Richard admitted, suddenly feeling like a teenager again. Elizabeth stepped closer, instinctively adjusting her son's shirt collar like she used to when he was little. "You know, it's been a while since I've seen your father," she remarked. "Maybe I should visit this so-called ranch too." The suggestion surprised Richard. "You? On the ranch? No shopping centers nearby?" Elizabeth feigned indignation. "You think I was born with a silver spoon? Before I met your father, I used to spend summers at my uncle's ranch in Virginia. I can tell a cow from a bull, you know." They both laughed, and Richard felt a wave of affection for his mother, who, despite all her urban sophistication, had stood by his father through the toughest times. "I'd love for you to come, Mom. I'm sure Dad would be happy too." When he finally returned to Golden Oak Ranch, Richard was greeted with a small celebration. Workers, neighbors, and even children from the local school had gathered to welcome him. At the center, beaming, were Andrew, Joseph, and Hannah. "Welcome back to the real world, son," Andrew joked, hugging him. Joseph shook his hand firmly. "The engineers started work on the irrigation system. It's looking impressive." Hannah approached last with a quiet but sincere smile. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come back," she admitted. "That New York City would swallow you up again." Richard looked around at the friendly faces, the genuine simplicity of the welcome, the magnificent sunset painting the fields gold, fields that now represented not just a business but a new beginning. "No," he replied with conviction. "New York isn't enough anymore." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In the months that followed, the transformation of Golden Oak Ranch progressed impressively. The modern irrigation system allowed for expanded cultivation, while agroecology techniques suggested by Hannah helped preserve the local biodiversity. Productivity increased significantly, and with it, the hiring of more workers from the region. Richard split his time between the ranch and occasional trips to New York City, where he oversaw the expansion of the Golden Oak model to other properties. To his satisfaction, investor interest in sustainable proposals grew rapidly, even attracting those who had initially been skeptical. One particularly pleasant afternoon, Richard and Hannah walked through the newly planted area of native trees, part of the reforestation project along the creek that ran through the property. "When we were kids, this creek was twice as wide," Hannah remarked, watching the water flow. "Years of deforestation on neighboring properties reduced its flow. With this reforestation, I hope it returns to what it was." "How long until these trees grow enough?" Richard asked, eyeing the newly planted saplings. "Years, maybe a decade for a significant impact," Hannah replied. "It's a long-term investment." "Like almost everything worth doing," Richard reflected. Hannah studied him curiously. Who would have thought the fast-paced businessman from New York would learn to think in decades, not quarters? Richard smiled, acknowledging the shift in his own mindset. "I'm still learning, but I'm starting to understand why your father and so many others refused to sell their land. It's not just a business, it's a legacy. Exactly, agreed Hannah, her eyes shining with passion for the subject. When we plant these trees, we're thinking of our children's children. The mention of future generations created a moment of silent connection between them. Over the past months, their friendship had blossomed into something deeper, though neither had taken the final step to turn it into romance. Hannah, Richard began, feeling his heart race. I need to ask you something. What? She looked at him, curious. He hesitated, searching for the right words. If I decided to stay permanently, to build a life here, do you think there'd be a place for me? Hannah held his gaze, understanding the real meaning behind his question. Are you thinking of leaving New York City for good? I'm seriously considering it, he admitted. I can manage my part of the business remotely with occasional trips, and here I found something I never had there. What? Hannah asked softly. Peace, purpose, and... He paused, gathering courage. And you. The declaration hung between them like something alive, vibrant. Hannah didn't seem surprised, as if she'd already known, as if she'd just been waiting for him to realize it too. Richard Thornton, she said with a faint smile, do you really think you could be happy away from the fancy restaurants and elegant parties of the city? I was never truly happy there, he confessed, just too busy to notice. Hannah took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. I don't want you to make this decision because of me, she said seriously. It has to be for you. It is for me, Richard assured her. You're part of it, a big part, but it's not just that. It's about the man I want to be from now on. Hannah studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of doubt or insincerity. What she saw seemed to satisfy her, because her smile widened. In that case, I think there's definitely a place for you here, she replied, finally closing the last of the distance between them. Their first kiss, there among the newly planted saplings that would one day become majestic trees, sealed more than the start of a romance. It sealed a promise of a shared future, rooted in the values they both now recognized as truly important. The news of Richard and Hannah's relationship was met with mixed reactions. Joseph, initially cautious, gradually accepted it upon seeing his daughter's genuine happiness and Richard's sincere commitment to the community. Andrew, for his part, didn't hide his satisfaction at seeing his son find love based on real values, not social convenience. Perhaps the biggest surprise was Elizabeth Thornton's reaction when she finally visited the ranch months later. Defying all expectations, she adapted to rural life with surprising ease. I always thought my mother would faint at the sight of a chicken up close, Richard remarked to his father as they watched Elizabeth helping Hannah harvest vegetables in the community garden they'd established near the school. Your mother has many layers you never knew, Andrew replied. Before she was the socialite you knew, she was a young woman who loved riding on her grandfather's land. The revelation made Richard reflect on how much of his family's true essence had been hidden beneath the facade of urban success they'd built. Why did you never tell me about that past? About this ranch? Andrew sighed, his gaze lost in memories. Shame, perhaps. I failed spectacularly here, Richard. Lost everything my father built. When we started over in New York City, we swore we'd never endure that humiliation again. And maybe we wanted to protect you from knowing. Protect me? Or protect yourselves? Richard asked, without hostility. Probably both, admitted Andrew. But look at us now. The circle has closed in a way I never imagined. Indeed, the circle had closed in unexpected ways. The Golden Oak Ranch project had become a success story, studied and replicated in other regions. The partnership between family farming and sustainable technology had proven not only viable, but highly profitable, attracting national media attention. In an interview with a business magazine, Richard explained the philosophy behind the model. This isn't about charity or social responsibility as an afterthought. It's a new vision of business success, where positive impact on communities and the environment is an integral part of the growth strategy. The response was immediate. Invitations for speaking engagements, consulting offers, and new investments began pouring in. Thornton Construction, once known only for its luxury real estate developments, was now a benchmark for sustainable development. Amid this professional success, Richard and Hannah built their relationship with the same careful and respectful approach they applied to the land. Nothing was rushed, nothing forced. Every step was openly discussed, every challenge faced together. "I never thought I'd fall for a businessman from New York City," Hannah confessed one evening, as they gazed at the stars from the porch of the main house, now renovated, but still retaining its original charm. "And I never imagined I'd find my purpose on a ranch in rural Texas," Richard replied, lacing his fingers through hers. "Life has a funny sense of humor." "Speaking of humor," Hannah said with a mischievous smile, "the school children are asking when you two are getting married." Richard raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Are they now?" "Mm-hmm. Apparently, there's even a bet among them about which month it'll be." Richard laughed, but the mention of marriage planted a seed in his mind that would bloom in the coming months. When he finally proposed to Hannah, it wasn't in a fancy restaurant or on some extravagant trip, as he might have in his former life. It was during the first full harvest, after implementing the new planting system, when the whole community gathered to celebrate the impressive results. Amid the festivities, local musicians playing, tables laden with food, children weaving between the adults, Richard called for silence. Kneeling before Hannah, in front of everyone who had become part of his new life, he said, "I grew up believing success meant accumulating wealth, status, power. You taught me that real success is in nurturing relationships, in building something. That benefits many, not just yourself. You helped me rediscover my roots and find a greater purpose." He paused, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Hannah Miller, would you do me the honor of marrying me?" Hannah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Around them, the entire community held its breath, especially the school children, who, as Richard would later learn, had been accomplices in planning the surprise. "Yes," she answered simply, then added with a smile, "but only if you promise." Never to try intimidating honest ranchers again. The crowd erupted in applause and laughter as Richard stood to embrace her, sealing the moment with a kiss. The wedding, held 6 months later, was a celebration blending rural traditions with urban sophistication, a perfect reflection of the couple's journey. Held outdoors beneath the ranch's ancient trees, it brought together people from worlds that once seemed irreconcilable. Executives from New York City, local ranchers, school children, and international investors drawn to the sustainable project. Andrew, with tears in his eyes, led Joseph's daughter to the makeshift altar where Richard waited. Elizabeth, elegant even in a simpler dress than her usual formal attire, sat beside Joseph, both sharing the pride and emotion of the moment. "Who would have thought?" Joseph whispered to Elizabeth during the ceremony. "Our families united after so many years." "Perhaps it was always meant to be," she replied with a serene smile. The honeymoon was a journey through rural communities in Brazil that had implemented projects inspired by the Golden Oak model. To many, it might have seemed an odd choice, more work than pleasure. But for Richard and Hannah, it was the perfect combination of their shared passions, sustainable development and community education. Upon their return, they found a surprise. Andrew and Elizabeth had decided to stay at the ranch indefinitely. "I think we've found our place too," Elizabeth explained, to her son's astonishment. "Your father is healthier and happier here than I've seen him in decades. And I've discovered I still have much to learn and contribute." Indeed, Elizabeth had surprised everyone by taking charge of the ranch's agritourism project, applying her expertise in social relations and her natural elegance to create a sophisticated yet authentic experience for city visitors interested in sustainable rural life. A year after the wedding, the news of Hannah's pregnancy brought a new wave of joy. The idea of raising a child in that environment, connected to nature and genuine values, filled Richard with a happiness he had never imagined possible during his days as a lonely executive in New York City. "Do you think our child will prefer the city or the countryside?" he asked Hannah one night, gently touching her now visible belly. "Our son or daughter will have the best of both worlds," she replied with conviction. "Strong roots here, but wings to fly wherever they wish." Richard reflected on the wisdom of those words. It was exactly what he himself had found. The freedom that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you came from. One afternoon, while overseeing the construction of the new wing of the rural school, a project funded by the foundation he had created with part of his personal wealth, Richard received an unexpected visitor. A luxury car parked near the construction site, and out stepped none other than Michael, his former business partner. "Michael!" Richard exclaimed, genuinely surprised. "What are you doing here?" His former partner looked out of place in his impeccable suit, observing the rural surroundings with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "I came to see for myself," Michael replied, extending his hand for a formal handshake. "The famous golden oak model that's on every impact investor's lips." Richard accepted the handshake, still processing the surprise. "Well, here it is. Not exactly the automated monoculture project we originally planned." Michael took in the scene around him. Local workers building the school, the sustainable irrigation system operating in the adjacent fields, the carefully marked preservation areas. "No, it's definitely not," he agreed, his expression hard to read. "But from the numbers I've seen, it's working surprisingly well." Richard offered a tour of the property, which Michael reluctantly accepted at first. As they walked, with Richard explaining the innovations and results, he noticed a subtle shift in his former partner's demeanor. Skepticism gave way to genuine interest. "I have to admit, Richard," Michael remarked as they paused to watch the sunset from the main house's porch, "when you abandoned our original plans, I thought you'd lost your mind, that you were throwing away years of work over sentimentality. And now?" Michael gave a slight smile, the closest to an admission of fault Richard had ever seen from him. "Now I see that maybe you spotted something I didn't. The market is changing. Younger investors especially are looking for exactly the kind of model you created here." "It wasn't just me," Richard corrected. "It was a collective effort. Hannah, Mr. Miller, my father, the whole community." Michael watched Hannah in the distance, chatting animatedly with some children in the community garden, her pregnant belly clearly visible under her simple dress. "You've really changed, haven't you?" he asked with a note of reluctant admiration. "This isn't just a phase or a marketing strategy." "I have," Richard confirmed. "Or maybe I just finally found myself." After Michael left, Richard reflected on how much his life had transformed in just 2 years. From the ruthless businessman focused solely on profit to the man now eagerly awaiting the birth of his first child, committed to a business model that balanced economic prosperity with social and environmental well-being. When Mary Ann was born on a spring dawn, the entire ranch celebrated. The little girl with lively eyes and dark hair like her mother's instantly became the center of everyone's attention, especially her grandparents, who took turns caring for and doting on her. "She was born in the same room where you were. Born," Joseph told Hannah as they watched their granddaughter sleeping in the handmade cradle he had built himself, "and where your grandfather was born before you. And where our grandchildren will be born one day," Hannah added, exchanging a loving glance with Richard, continuing a story that was almost cut short. Richard, holding his daughter's tiny hand, felt the weight and beauty of that continuity. He thought of the ambitious young man he had been, the man he had become, and the father he now was. The journey hadn't been straightforward or easy, but every step, even the most painful ones, had been necessary to bring him here. "You know what's most ironic?" he remarked to Hannah later as they watched the sunset from the porch, little Mary Ann sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "I came here to transform this ranch, to modernize it, as I used to say. In the East, and it was the ranch that transformed me." Hannah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It wasn't just the ranch, Richard. It was everything it stands for. Connection, community, purpose. Things that were always here waiting for you to rediscover them." Andrew, who had approached with cups of coffee for the couple, overheard the comment. "Your grandfather used to say the land never lies," he said, handing them the cups. "It always gives back exactly what you put into it. In work, in respect, in love." Richard nodded, deeply understanding the wisdom in those words. "And what we plant now," he added, looking at his sleeping daughter, "will be harvested by generations we haven't even dreamed of yet." As the sun set on the horizon, painting the now flourishing fields in gold. Richard Thornton, the businessman who had once come to buy and transform this land, recognized the irony and beauty of his journey. He had arrived as a conqueror and stayed as a guardian. He had intended to teach and ended up learning life's most valuable lessons. The greatest of them, perhaps, was understanding that true success isn't measured by material achievements or power, but by the positive impact we leave on the world and the lives we touch. It was a lesson he would now pass on, starting with his little daughter, the fruit of two families fate had separated and brought together again. Under the starry sky of the Texas prairie, with fertile earth beneath his feet and his family's, love around him, Richard finally felt at home. The end of the story. Dear listener, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Your thoughts on Richard's transformation are precious to us. Share what moved you the most in this journey of rediscovery and values. Until next time.